what I'd like to speak about today is another American miracle where God intervened in the affairs of our nation. And thankfully he did, because the Battle of Midway was the turning point in the Pacific War. And beyond the turning point in the Pacific War, if we had not won that battle, then the plan that President Roosevelt had and his generals in Europe would have had to change dramatically. They were following something they referred to as Plan D. D is in Delta. And Plan D really was that we were going to focus all of our efforts on Europe, and the people we had in the Pacific, the troops we had in the Pacific would be there, they would fight, but our effort was going to be Europe. It was critical because at that point, Germany was attacking Russia, and France, had fallen. England was fighting pretty much on its own. We had had the Lend-Lease Act to try to help them. And then subsequently, we began providing troops. But it was a massive effort, especially so since we had been effectively an isolationist nation up through that point. And so, had the Battle of Midway been lost, the Japanese would have continued on, taken Australia, because that was their next target. They would have used Midway as a launch pad for attacking Hawaii. They would have gotten Hawaii because we would have had virtually no Pacific Fleet to defend it. And then their next attack would have been on the West Coast of the United States of America. And so we would have had to divert from the effort in Europe and potentially lost Europe as well. So that this was really key. This was a very significant attack, and by all rights, we should have lost. In the winter of 1941 into 42, the Japanese military was unstoppable. They had conquered almost all of the Western Pacific. In 1941, December 7th, we had the day that will live in infamy, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. That brought us into the war against them, and then also we declared war at that point against the Axis powers in Europe. December 41, the Japanese went on to invade Wake Island. They resisted for a period of time, but ultimately fell at the end of the month. Hong Kong fell, Malaysia fell, Thailand fell, Guam fell, Burma fell, British Borneo was conquered, and the Netherlands, East Indies were conquered. In February of 42, there was the Battle of Singapore. The British lost several of their ships, some of their largest ships, and Winston Churchill called it the worst disaster in British military history. And then to top everything off in February, a Japanese sub attacked a refinery in California and sat off the coast in visual, in eyesight of people who were on the beaches. And they were brazen, and it was one sub commander who I guess had a personal vendetta and attacked the refinery there, just north of Santa Barbara. And then from January 7th through April 9th, you had the Battle of Bataan until Bataan finally fell, and you had the Bataan Death March. And then June 4th, 2 months later, the Battle of Midway. Now, the picture above is an artist's depiction, the painting is called The Famous 4 Minutes. And it was In that battle, you can see that Japan's offensive in the Pacific came to a halt. And what it is showing in the picture is Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise in Yorktown attacking the fleet that was led by Vice Admiral Nagumo. Um, and this was the morning of the 4th of June, 1942. June 4th was the date that the Japanese had selected to attack Midway. June 4th also wound up being the day that they were stopped in the Pacific, and never again had the same command of the seas after that. And you see the carrier Akagi in the foreground. There were 4 carriers, Kaga off in the distance, Soryo, which you can sort of see through the smoke. They were all destroyed within those 4 minutes. And then there was a 4th carrier, the Hiryu, which was a good distance away, and that was attacked later that day. Now, after the Japanese had just been on the march and before the Battle of Midway, there was an attempt to do something, but there really wasn't much that we could do. There was no simple way to reach Japan with our bombers. We had no bombers with a range that was long enough. And in fact, the raid that ultimately was recommended by Jimmy Doolittle, who was a real hero even prior to that, World War I and during the intervening years between the 2 wars. He hatched a plan to have B-25 bombers, 16 of them, take off from the deck of a carrier, an aircraft carrier. Now, there was no way that those planes could do that. You know, they needed just more runway than that. And so they continued to work and work and work until they came up with an approach where they could take a B-25. They lightened it. They used techniques in taking off. They made some changes to the aircraft so that they could get the B-25 so that it could take off in that short distance. And they had a problem, though, because there was not enough fuel to return. So they knew that they were going to only be able to bomb if they made it. And then they would have to just ditch their planes, hopefully in China, which was mostly friendly at that point. Some was occupied. In fact, I'm not even sure it was mostly friendly at that point. Well, they went and they had this surprise raid. They bombed several cities. There's a film, if you've not seen it, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo. It's a good one to watch. Well, they ran out of fuel, and many of the bombers crash landed along the coast of China, some in the water. Doolittle and many of the others in the raid were able to find their way back with the help of the Chinese. Well, the Japanese then inflicted severe reprisals on the Chinese, not knowing exactly who helped these raiders. They burned villages and killed more than 250,000 civilians in the areas where the planes had come down. But ultimately, this was a one-off. We didn't have any massive force. It was really more a wake-up call to Japan that one day we were going to come back. But it certainly got their attention, but it didn't change the course of the war. It did change the morale in America, however. Now, the Japanese plan for victory at Midway was this. The Japanese admiral, actually Vice Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, planned to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet by invading Midway. Now, Midway, you can see in the lower right, there were 2 islands, very small. The one on the left is Sand Island, and you can see the runway on there, and it takes up most of the island. And then there's Eastern Island that has almost nothing on it. And This is the only place you could launch an attack from in the middle of the Pacific. It's the only runway at that time that was long enough to land the bombers and land many of the planes that would need to make that journey. It was less than 2,000 acres, which is about the size of some big malls. So there really isn't much there other than this airport. And so his goal was to draw the American carriers into a trap and destroy them. And then, and part of that goal was to misdirect part of the fleet so that the fleet would go to chase some false information about the raid happening in the Aleutian Islands. You imagine how big the Pacific Ocean is, and now imagine a time before satellites. How do you find a fleet of ships? It might be a big fleet, but in the ocean it's very tiny, very hard to find. And so he felt that he would have the element of surprise, that he could trap them, and he was going to provide false intelligence to indicate that they were attacking the Aleutian Islands, and then that would weaken the American forces. Well, the Japanese also possessed overwhelming advantages. They had superior air forces. The Japanese Zero aircraft was far superior to any other plane that any other nation in the world possessed. And certainly it was much superior to the US fighters, both in its speed and its maneuverability. I believe that the distances it could travel and such were also an advantage. The American torpedo planes, for example, were grossly underpowered. They were death traps, and they were they struggled with all kinds of mechanical problems, both with the planes and with the torpedoes. In order to attack, they had to slow down to less than 100 miles an hour. Anything more than that, the torpedoes would not release. And in fact, quite often, the torpedoes did not release. And in the attack on the Japanese fleet at Midway, there was at least one of the American aircraft where the torpedo did not release, and they attempted unsuccessfully to just dive bomb into the one of the carriers. And also many of the torpedoes were often duds. So having gone through this harrowing experience of flying at a very low speed for an extended period of time with no real protection, 100 feet above the water, aiming at a ship and easy targets for anti-aircraft and fighters, to drop your torpedo and then find out it's a dud, it was very demoralizing, clearly. And most of those guys died. And in fact, everyone in the torpedo bombers, torpedo planes actually wound up dying. Superior fleet. Admiral Yamamoto commanded a force of more than 129 ships, which included 86 fighting ships, and virtually every Japanese warship was in the Armada, including 4 carriers that could be used for military work. There were others that were on some other missions, but he had almost the entire fleet. And the Japanese at that point had over 3 times the number of combat ships as the US. They also had far more experienced combat pilots, and their pilots, as well as their sailors, were hardened by years of battle. Remember, they had been fighting in China for many years. And so, sorry about that. Now, in looking at the battle, there are multiple historians who have called it a miracle. One named his narrative, Midway, Incredible Victory. Another one, Gordon Prange, who was there, he published an account of the battle, an eyewitness account, which was entitled Miracle at Midway. Another one's memoirs, was titled God Was at Midway. And he talks about the divine intervention that he personally saw at work. And then Mitsuo Fuchida and Masataki Okimaya wrote a book afterwards called Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan. Now, first miracle, and I'm going to go through and just enumerate some of the miracles. I don't think these are all the miracles, and we'll call them miracles. Others might say, well, these are just unusual coincidences. But when you see how many they were and how critical each one was, it becomes obvious these were not coincidences. The first miracle, the breaking of the Jan 25 code. This code was an incredible code with tens of thousands of 5-digit numbers that corresponded to Japanese words. And so you can see on the right a little piece of a written portion of the code where you see the 5 numbers and then the Japanese word. And this was a time before computers, and Commander Joe Rockford had a group at Station Hypo, which was at Pearl Harbor, and this small group of very brilliant guys worked day and night to break a code with odds, many thousands to one against them. But just shortly before the Battle at Midway, weeks before, they broke the code. This was so secret that it was not revealed to the United States or to the world, to civilians, until the 1950s. But they broke the code. And they had intercepted some cables amongst the Japanese that enabled Admiral Nimitz to know that the next attack by the Japanese would be Midway Island. And he also knew from the cables what ships would be there and how many ships. Well, by knowing the Japanese plans and their forces, he was able to prepare an ambush. Now, knowing this and being able to plan an ambush is not the same as being able to do it, because you know where the forces are. But again, the ocean is large. It didn't guarantee victory. It made it likely a battle was going to take place, and it gave the Americans a significant advantage by knowing where to look for the Japanese fleet. But the American scout planes still needed to find a location of Japan's fleet before they found ours. Second miracle was the 2 key assistants to Admiral Nagumo. I'm sorry, I'm screwing up his name. But the 2 number 2 guys, or numbers 2 and number 3, Nagumo's 2 air commanders, Mitsuo Fuchida, had emergency surgery for acute appendicitis a couple of days before the attack, and Nagumo's close friend and commander, Minoru Genda, had pneumonia and was hospitalized, likewise, a few days before the attack. And he was the one who was a brilliant tactician who planned the air attack on Pearl Harbor. Third miracle was the repair of the Yorktown in 48 hours. Admiral Nimitz only had 3 aircraft carriers, but one of them was the Yorktown, and it was very badly damaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea. And they estimated it was going to take 3 more months of repair. And I remember my father telling me a little bit about this, because he was a naval architect in World War II working out at Mare Island in California. And when the ships came back in, they had to repair the ships, and they had to do it as quickly as they possibly could. I remember we would watch Victory at Sea together. Some of you may have seen that film series. And he would point out ships that he had worked on where they had to redesign things, sometimes putting one class, different bow on a ship than the class of ship would have normally gotten because of the timing issues in getting these things back out to sea. Well, they had estimated that it was going to take 3 more months of repair. And so now this is, just the end of May. And Nimitz has the battle plan, so he knows when the Japanese are going to attack, and that's not enough time. So he commanded his men to finish as fast as they could, and they worked round the clock, 1,200 repairmen. They got the job done in 48 hours. Incredible, a miracle. And you can imagine how many small little things they had to make decisions on, and the Yorktown was able to make it to the battle. The fourth miracle was they spotted the enemy first. That was absolutely key. Well, the American scout plane was a Catalina PBY. You can see it on the right-hand side. It was interesting because the co-pilot had deviated from procedure and had insisted on loading up 50 extra gallons of fuel when they before they took off from Midway. And the pilot and the crew were actually pretty upset about that. And the co-pilot just said, well, this is for the wives and the kiddies, so that we can make it back. But the concern was they might not be able to take off because it was so much fuel. Well, they took off. They did make it off the ground. They continued flying, and they searched, and they knew when they needed to turn around. But instead of turning around, they decided they would search for 10 more minutes. They hadn't found the Japanese fleet. And then they got to the end of that 10 minutes, and actually the crew then said, let's keep looking. And so they searched for another 10 minutes. And at that point, they concluded that they hadn't found it. They were about to turn back. And they were in their mind, or actually beyond the point of no return. And that's when they spotted the Japanese armada. It was 09:30 on June the 3rd. And they radioed their position, and they were told to stay there and map out the fleet, which they did. So they spent 2 hours thinking that they weren't going to be able to make it back, but willing to do that and radioing back the information on the fleet. They did make it back just as they ran out of fuel. They had gotten 2 hours more out of their fuel than any other Catalina PBY with the same fuel load, and they were able to land safely. A little miracle. Miracle 5, the American bombers surprised the Japanese fleet. Well, they knew where the fleet was. The Americans knew where the fleet was, so they dispatched the bombers from Midway. And at 12:30, they took off, 9 B-17 Flying Fortress bombers. You see some depicted on the right there. At 16:30, they found the fleet. It was 4 hours to get to the fleet. They dropped their bombs from 8, 10, 12,000 feet. They had anti-aircraft guns that were battling. They flew through the flak and the rest. Well, all the bombs missed their targets. It's very difficult from that height to bomb a moving ship on the ocean. No planes were damaged, and all 9 planes returned to Midway. Well, this alerted the Japanese that the Americans knew their position, but because they were heavy bombers and they knew they were out of Midway, the Japanese didn't think that the American fleet was anywhere nearby. The 6th miracle, the Japanese scout planes were delayed. So the Japanese did not find the American fleet right away. At 04:30 on June 4th, there were 7 scout planes that were sent out to find the U.S. fleet. One had a mechanical problem and was delayed a half an hour. Well, that was the one that was supposed to search the sector in which the American fleet was actually located. And so that delayed the Japanese discovery of the American ships by a half an hour, which was a critical delay that was absolutely vital to the American victory, because everything that happened was based upon a calendar of time or schedule of time that a few minutes, one way or another, in some cases 30 seconds, one way or another, would have meant the Americans would have been defeated. Then the Japanese bombed Midway. They sent their carriers from, they sent their ships. I apologize, I'm racing too fast here. They sent their planes from the carriers to bomb Midway. So they were able to load their planes with bombs, with torpedoes, and at 04:30, the same time that the scout plane was sent out, the first scout planes, the Japanese aircraft carriers turned into the wind. That was critical because the planes could only take off into the wind, they could only land into the wind. So the aircraft carriers turned into the wind and they launched 108 planes, all loaded with bombs, destined to bomb Midway. The first wave that attacked Midway inflicted considerable damage, but by and large, they tried to avoid hitting the runways because they thought they would be victorious quickly and these would be their runways, so they didn't want to damage them. And so the squadron leader radioed back that they were going to need a second attack, that they'd used their bombs, but they needed to come back to destroy more. And so Admiral Nagumo ordered the returning planes to be reloaded with bombs. You know, I should have practiced the Japanese names a little bit before this. My apologies. And then when he learned that American carriers were in the vicinity, he ordered the planes rearmed with torpedoes, all of which took precious time and left the carriers vulnerable. So what happened was this. The bombers come back, and actually the planes come back, and they had been configured with bombs to bomb Midway. And he goes back and they go back and they land on the carriers and they begin reloading them with bombs. And then partway through, he discovers that the American carriers are in the vicinity and he orders the planes to be rearmed now with torpedoes. So the bombs that they had just loaded on, they needed to pull off and quickly reload them with torpedoes so they could attack the ships, the American fleet, instead of Midway Island. Well, this caused the loss of precious time. It also meant that the decks were filled with planes loaded with fuel, loaded with either torpedoes or bombs, and torpedoes and bombs scattered all over the deck because they were really just scrapping procedures just to get things done quickly. The seventh miracle was Admiral Spruance made a quick decision to take an action his quick decision was normally would not have, the decision would not have been taken that quickly. You see a picture of him to the right. So 5:20 a.m., PBY 4V58, which was another scout plane like the one you saw before, Catalina, this one piloted by Howard Addy, sent a message to Midway indicating that he had seen an unidentified aircraft, probably one of the late leaving scout planes. 10 minutes later, he reported sighting a single Japanese carrier. At 5:45, so 25 minutes later, another scout plane scouting in the sector next to Addy's messaged Midway that two groups of 45 planes were headed in their direction. Addy was flying in and out of rain squalls. He had just turned his plane around. When looking through a break in the clouds, he saw the entire Japanese carrier force. He had discovered it. And so at 5:52, he radioed Midway with a critical message. And when Spruance heard the sighting, he immediately said, launch everything you have at the earliest possible moment. There was no indecision whatsoever. He was a last-minute substitution in this position. The Japanese fleet was still 200 miles from the American carriers. The range of the torpedo planes was only 175 miles. So he made this decision, even knowing that the planes would not be able to return. They would go out and attack and not return. And the pilots who flew knew that they might well be flying to their deaths, and that at the very least, they were probably going to wind up in the ocean. Well, the timing of the dive bombers. Okay, in the midst of this frantic activity, this is a quote from the book Seven Miracles That Saved America. And the frantic activity was the frantic activity on board the deck or the decks of the Japanese carriers. 16 dauntless dive bombers, and that's a picture of a dauntless dive bomber there, from Midway, delivered another attack against the Japanese fleet. Now, these were sluggish planes. They were piloted by green pilots who had no experience in this type of aircraft. Remember, this is really the first major battle of the war. They made very easy targets for the Zeros, and half of the bombers were shot down. The remaining planes did drop their bombs, but not one of them hit the target. And the result was another brave but futile effort by the Midway defenders against the enemy fleet. But even though they were not effective, the confusion caused Nagumo and his staff to miss the importance of the message sent by the scout plane just moments before, that the American fleet had changed course and turned into the wind. And because of their extremely short runways, the aircraft carriers, as you recall, have to turn into the wind to enable the airplanes to take off. So that was an indication that they were about to take off. He would have had several more minutes to prepare had he listened and had he heard that and had he considered the impact. The next miracle, the Nautilus shows up, submarine, and it strips off the destroyer Arashi. At 8:09 a.m., the Nautilus arrives and it begins stalking the Japanese fleet. And it submerges and then it surfaces, it submerges and it surfaces. The fleet sees him and then he fires a torpedo at the Arashi, the Japanese destroyer. And so the Arashi breaks away from the fleet, pursues the Nautilus, and begins depth charging it. Well, in doing that, it fell behind the rest of the fleet. And this ultimately would create a very key clue for the American attack. And so as we go through, you'll see why this was so important. Miracle 10, all the ordnance on the carrier's decks. Okay, we talked a little bit about that before, but now he had no fighters to accompany his attack craft because they were all in the air responding to the repeated attacks from the Midway-based bombers. And many of those bombers were damaged and low on fuel. He also had 100 returning Japanese bombers, all low on fuel. The waiting fighters were starting to circle overhead, and if they weren't allowed to land because the carriers were launching the attack planes, the returning bombers would have to ditch into the sea. So Nagumo ordered the flight decks cleared so his returning bombers could land. And he ordered that all of the attackers have their bombs taken off and be rearmed with torpedoes. And so for the third time that morning, weapon crews had to arm their aircraft with another type of weapon, replacing the bombs that had just attached to the Japanese fighters with smaller torpedoes one more time. And then the next miracle, Commander Waldron's hunch. Well, at 8:54 a.m., the American torpedo planes were spotted by the Japanese. There were 10 Devastator torpedo planes, very slow, light armor, sluggish controls, no match for the Zeros. The torpedo planes we talked about in the very beginning, they just were not good planes. And they couldn't find the Japanese fleet on top of everything else. Plus, they had no radio contact allowed between them. Well, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led the attack. And the American fighters that were potentially going to protect them had already ditched in the ocean or had headed back. And Waldron could not find the Japanese fleet. His plane had the responsibility of sighting them first. Well, on a hunch, he just started a gentle turn to the north. The others had no idea why he was doing that, but just concluded, well, they had no choice. They had to follow him. None of the pilots broke radio silence to ask him where he was going. All 14 of them followed him. 7 minutes later, they saw the Japanese and attacked. There were no Japanese damaged in the attack. All the devastators were lost. But the attack was absolutely critical to the ultimate victory. It threw the Japanese fighters down, so they could not protect from another wave that would be coming. Well, the 12th miracle was the wake of the Arashi, the Japanese destroyer that had split off in order to depth charge and attempt to destroy the Nautilus. And here's a quote from Seven Miracles That Saved America. A few minutes behind the flight of Devastator torpedo bombers, and in a different piece of the sky, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, Air Group Commander from the USS Enterprise, led 32 Dauntless dive bombers toward the last reported location of the Japanese fleet. Getting there, he too found nothing but open ocean and empty skies, no carriers, no wakes. But unlike the commander of the torpedo planes, he didn't use his gut to find the Japanese fleet. Providence was going to provide another way. Look at that, he almost shouted to his gunner, 20,000 feet below him. And at the very edge of the distance, he could have seen it in the haze. He saw a single wake. The Japanese destroyer Arashi, having abandoned its efforts to find and kill the U.S. submarine that had been hassling the Japanese fleet, had reversed course and was steaming at top speed back toward the Japanese task force. Heading northwest, the Arashi was acting like a homing beacon, leading the American attackers toward their targets as if it were a guide. The dive bombers followed it, and after anxious miles, the Japanese carrier fleet came into view. A miracle. Miracle 13, the unprotected fleet. All of the Zero fighters had been ordered to descend from altitude to stop the American Devastator attacks. So even though all the Devastators were lost, the Zero fighters were pulled down out of the sky. And so between the Devastator dive bombers and the carriers, there was nothing but clear sky. There were no Zeros. He couldn't believe the Japanese commander could have made such a horrible mistake. But it was right before him. All of the Zeros had descended and taken after the Devastators, leaving the carriers exposed to an attack from altitude. Now, the Devastators arrived at just that instant in time. That was a miracle in itself. They could have arrived 10 minutes earlier. The fighters would have met them and probably stopped them. The Devastators could have arrived 10 minutes later. The fighters would have met them and probably stopped them. But because they arrived exactly when they did, in this coordinated, synchronized fashion, not synchronized by men, but synchronized by God, they were successful. And as they descended, the chaos aboard the carrier became clear. Dozens of aircraft crammed on the deck, multiple fuel lines stretched between them, hundreds of exposed bombs thrown around the deck. It was a tinderbox, a death trap, written by there in Seven Miracles That Saved America. So the American victory was secured in 4 minutes. Some say 6 minutes, but a few minutes. It was a nearly perfect attack. The first bomb hit among the refueling fighters, exploding in a fury of black smoke and red flame. Another penetrated the forward elevator and exploded among more refueling aircraft, torpedoes, and bombs. A third bomb hit a fuel truck sitting directly underneath the captain's bridge, instantly incinerating the captain and his senior officials in a yellow fireball. The elevator collapsed, sending fire into the waiting aircraft below the deck, all of them fueled and loaded with torpedoes and bombs. By themselves, the 3 bombs wouldn't have been enough to sink the carrier. But they set off a conflagration of fuel tanks and aircraft and torpedoes and bullets and fragmentation bombs. In minutes, the fires on the cargo were completely out of control. And then 1,000 meters to the south, the Japanese carrier Akagi was experiencing almost exactly the same thing. The first bomb hit the midship elevator, detonating improperly stored ammunition, fuel, and bombs. The second bomb hit among the waiting aircraft. 2 bombs were all it took to take her down, and farther east, the Suryo had also been hit by 3 bombs, neatly placed from fore to aft. 5 minutes after the attack, The Sorio captain gave the devastating order to abandon ship. Then he committed suicide by rushing into the towering fires that had spread across his deck. 3 minutes after starting their attack, the dive bombers left most of the Japanese carrier fleet in flames, and within hours, 3 carriers slipped into their watery graves. And then the final blow, the carrier Hiryu. At 4:45 p.m., the carrier Hiryu was attacked by aircraft from the Enterprise in Yorktown. 4 bombs hit it in rapid succession, and fire quickly spread throughout the entire ship in a fashion very similar to the other 3. And as with the Japanese carriers destroyed earlier in the day, the Hiryu's deck was filled with planes full of fuel while bombs were being loaded. Well, the magnitude of the victories was immense. Despite the fact that the Japanese outnumbered and outgunned the U.S. fleet, they suffered a devastating defeat, and they would never master the Pacific again. The total casualties suffered by the Japanese included 2,500 men, 4 aircraft carriers, 332 airplanes. The United States lost 307 men, 1 carrier, that was the Yorktown, and 147 airplanes. The Japanese military would never quite recover. Their finest and most experienced pilots were gone, and from this point forward, the United States would be on the offense throughout the Pacific campaign. Everything changed. Had that not happened, it is quite likely that the Japanese would have ultimately invaded the West Coast if we had not declared defeat prior to that. If that had happened, I think we would have likely lost the war in Europe. So you can begin to imagine what the world would have been like had this one battle been lost. When you look at the scriptures, you see time and again situations where the Jews are on the verge of losing everything. Israel is essentially lost, and then God intervenes. And the most hopeful words in the English language, I believe, are "but God." But God intervened at one point or another.